As the crisp air of October rolls in, the world takes on a different hue. The days grow shorter, the winds colder, and the shadows longer. It's a time when the boundaries between the living and the dead seem to blur, and a chill creeps into both the weather and your bones. This is the season for spooky stories, when the eerie and unsettling come to life. Here are 3 true fall horror stories, each chilling in its own way, sure to send shivers down your spine as you settle in for a cold October night. Story 1. The Haunted Pumpkin Patch. It was the fall of 1994 when Sarah, a college student living in rural Maine, decided to visit a local pumpkin patch. The weather was perfect, the sun low in the sky, casting long golden shadows across the fields. She had heard from some of the locals about an old pumpkin patch on the outskirts of town, a place that had been in operation for generations. The owners were an elderly couple, Mr. and Mrs. Turner, who had lived on the farm for decades. Despite the rumors of strange happenings, Sarah, who loved autumn and everything that came with it, was curious. The idea of picking the perfect pumpkin seemed irresistible. The Turners were kind, though their house seemed to have an unsettling aura. Mr. Turner, a man in his late 70s with a deep, gravelly voice, had always been known to be a bit eccentric. His wife, Clara, was much quieter, often sitting in the house by the window with a faraway look in her eyes. The couple lived on a secluded patch of land, and for years, no one thought much of their eccentricities. However, there were whispers in town of strange occurrences near the farm. Despite the warnings from her friends, Sarah decided to visit one October evening. The moment she stepped onto the property, she felt something odd, an unnatural stillness in the air, like the world was holding its breath. She shrugged it off, figuring it was just her imagination. Mr. Turner greeted her warmly, and soon she was wandering through the pumpkin patch, searching for the perfect one. That's when she saw it. In the far corner of the patch, hidden behind a large cluster of vines, was a pumpkin unlike any she had ever seen. It was large, its skin a deep, unsettling shade of orange, almost too bright for the dimming light of dusk. As she approached, the air grew colder and she felt a strange sensation, as though someone was watching her. Suddenly, a voice behind her startled her. "That's not one you want to pick, miss." She turned to see Mrs. Turner standing at the edge of the patch. Her pale face was almost ghostly in the fading light, and her eyes seemed to gleam with an intensity that made Sarah feel uneasy. "Why?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling slightly. Mrs. Turner took a slow step forward, her gaze never leaving the strange pumpkin. "That one's not like the others. It's been here too long. The land doesn't want it, and neither should you." Despite her growing discomfort, Sarah couldn't resist the pull of the pumpkin. "I just want to take a look," she insisted, stepping closer. Mrs. Turner sighed. "You're not listening, child. You should leave it alone." But it was too late. Sarah had already crouched down to inspect the pumpkin. As she touched it, a cold, clammy sensation spread up her fingers, and a low whisper seemed to rise from the earth itself. The wind picked up, howling in a way that sent shivers through her body. She quickly stood and turned to leave, but as she did, she noticed the vines around her legs tightening, as if they were trying to pull her down. Panicking, she jerked her legs free and stumbled backward. Mrs. Turner was nowhere to be seen, and the sky had turned an ominous shade of purple. Sarah didn't look back as she ran toward the farmhouse, but as she neared the door, the ground beneath her feet seemed to shift, like something was moving below. She banged on the door, desperate to get inside, and when Mr. Turner opened it, he only muttered, "It's too late. It's already chosen you." The next morning, Sarah left the farm without saying a word to anyone. She never returned to the pumpkin patch, and she never saw the Turners again. Rumor had it that they left soon after, their house abandoned. Some say that the patch is still there, with strange pumpkins that seem to grow far faster than they should, and that the land continues to claim anyone who dares to pick the wrong one. Story 2. The Disappearing Camper. In 2011, A group of 4 friends from Vermont decided to take a weekend trip to the Adirondack Mountains. They planned to camp near the remote lake of Lake Lila, a peaceful spot known for its stunning views and tranquil waters. None of them had ever been there before, but they were eager for an adventure. The night before their trip, they stopped at a small general store to buy supplies. The elderly store clerk, who was sitting behind the counter, eyed them warily when they mentioned their destination. "You sure you want to go to Lake Lila?" he asked, his voice gruff. "We're just camping. It's supposed to be beautiful out there," one of the friends, Jake, responded, shrugging it off. The clerk didn't seem convinced. "Well, you youngsters don't know what you're getting into. There's something strange about that place." They laughed off his warnings and continued on their way, arriving at the lake late that afternoon. The setting sun painted the sky with hues of orange and pink, making the water shimmer. It was everything they had hoped for: serene, untouched, and utterly peaceful. They set up camp and spent the evening around the fire, telling ghost stories and roasting marshmallows. But as the night grew darker, the mood began to shift. Strange sounds from the forest crept in, sounds that didn't seem to belong to any known animal. Whispering winds, the rustle of leaves, and the occasional crack of a twig breaking in the distance. At one point, Jake wandered off to relieve himself, heading into the woods just beyond their campsite. He was gone for nearly 30 minutes before the others started calling for him. His absence was unusual. He'd been gone far longer than necessary. When they went looking for him, they found no trace of Jake at all. No footprints, no signs of struggle, nothing. Panic set in as they realized their friend had simply vanished. They searched the woods for hours, but there was no sign of him. By the time they finally returned to the campsite, exhausted and terrified, the weather had shifted, and the wind began howling through the trees. The next morning, they reported Jake's disappearance to the local authorities. A search team combed the area, but they found nothing. No signs of Jake, no clues. Then, 3 days later, a hiker stumbled across Jake's backpack, found miles away from the campsite, wedged in a tree, as though it had been placed there deliberately. The strange part, there were no footprints leading to or from the tree. The case remains unsolved to this day, and no one has been able to explain what happened to Jake. Some say the lake is cursed. Others claim there are forces in the forest that cannot be understood. Regardless, the friends never spoke about the incident again.